Mercedes just went from dominating Formula One to fighting the FIA itself. And the timing could destroy their entire season. Because only days before the Canadian Grand Prix, the FIA moved to shut down the exact Mercedes engine trick that rivals believe made the Silver Arrows untouchable in 2026. 4 races. 4 wins. A massive championship lead. And now, suddenly, panic inside the paddock. Because this was not just a small technical detail. According to reports, Mercedes may have unlocked up to 20 extra horsepower once the engine reached race temperatures. Not in testing. Not in theory. During actual races. And rival teams immediately exploded. Ferrari pushed the FIA. Honda pushed the FIA. Audi pushed the FIA. Then everything changed. The FIA announced new hot temperature engine checks that begin exactly during the Canadian Grand Prix weekend. Which means Mercedes now faces a terrifying possibility. The advantage that built their dominance could disappear overnight. But here's the part nobody saw coming. This FIA ban may have exposed something even more dangerous than the engine itself. Because insiders inside Formula One are now asking whether the entire W17 was secretly built around this one controversial system. And if that is true, Canada could become the race where Mercedes' season starts collapsing in real time. At first, Mercedes looked almost unbeatable. Not just fast. Comfortably fast. The kind of speed that makes rival teams panic before the race even starts. And that is exactly what happened during the opening rounds of 2026. The W17 dominated everywhere. Fast corners. Slow corners. Long straights. Heavy braking zones. It looked like Mercedes had solved the new regulations before everyone else even understood them. But inside the paddock, engineers started noticing something strange. The car became even stronger once races settled in. That detail matters. Because most Formula One cars actually lose performance as temperatures rise. Tires degrade. Engines become harder to manage. Components overheat. Mercedes somehow became more dangerous. Especially on straights. And rival teams could not understand why. Then the first clues started leaking through the paddock. The FIA rules limited engine compression ratios to 16:1. Mercedes reportedly passed those checks perfectly when the engine was cold. But once the engine reached full operating temperatures during races, everything changed. Reports inside Formula One claimed the compression ratio could climb close to 18:1 once the system heated up above 130 degrees Celsius. That sounds small. But in Formula One, tiny numbers create massive consequences. Imagine blowing air into a balloon. The harder the pressure builds inside, the more explosive the release becomes. That is basically what compression does inside an engine. More compression means more power, more acceleration, more straight-line speed. And according to estimates from inside the paddock, Mercedes may have gained between 10 and 20 extra horsepower through this system alone. That is enormous in modern Formula One. Teams spend entire seasons trying to find one extra tenth of a second. Mercedes may have discovered several at once. And suddenly, rival teams realized something terrifying. Mercedes was not just ahead. They were operating under a completely different interpretation of the rules. That is when Ferrari, Honda, and Audi reportedly went directly to the FIA. Not because they could prove the engine was illegal, but because they believed Mercedes had found a loophole the regulations never intended to allow. And this is where the political war truly began. Because the FIA initially reviewed the engine and declared it legal under the current testing system. That decision changed everything. From Mercedes' perspective, the case should have been closed immediately. The car passed inspection. The rules were followed. The wins were earned. But rival teams refused to let the issue die. Why? Because Mercedes was not simply winning races. They were crushing the championship. After only 4 races, Mercedes already held a massive lead over Ferrari and McLaren. And Formula One teams know something dangerous happens when one team becomes too dominant. The sport itself starts reacting. That is exactly what Toto Wolff fears happen next. Because once pressure inside the paddock intensified, the FIA suddenly introduced new hot temperature engine checks that begin during the Canadian Grand Prix weekend. Meaning Mercedes now faces the biggest question of the entire season. What happens when the system that built their dominance can no longer operate the same way? But here's where the story becomes much bigger than just horsepower. Because the moment the FIA changed the testing procedure, Mercedes' real problem was finally exposed. The team may have built the entire W17 around this engine behavior. And that is terrifying if you are Toto Wolff. Formula One cars are not built like normal road cars where one part changes independently from everything else. Every system is connected. The engine affects cooling. Cooling affects aerodynamics. Aerodynamics affect tire temperatures. Tire temperatures affect race pace. One small regulation change can create a chain reaction through the entire car. And that is exactly what Mercedes is trying to avoid before Canada. Think about it like balancing a tower of blocks. If you suddenly remove one important piece near the bottom, the entire structure starts shaking. That may be what Mercedes is facing right now. Because if the engine can no longer reach the same compression levels during races, the car could behave completely differently in Montreal. Acceleration may suffer. Energy deployment may change. Cooling requirements could increase. Even braking balance can become unstable when engine behavior shifts unexpectedly. And Canada is probably the worst possible place for Mercedes to discover those weaknesses. Montreal is built around power. Long straights. Heavy acceleration. Aggressive braking zones. Tiny losses become instantly visible there. Especially in the speed traps. That is why every rival team is waiting for one specific moment this weekend. The first real top speed comparison. Because if Mercedes suddenly looks slower on the straights, the entire paddock will know immediately that the FIA restriction worked. And psychologically, that changes everything. Dominance in Formula One is not only about speed. It is about fear. When one team keeps winning comfortably, rivals stop believing they can catch them. Engineers become desperate. Drivers overpush. Mistakes multiply. Mercedes created exactly that atmosphere during the first races of 2026. But now, for the first time all season, the grid senses vulnerability. And McLaren already proved why that matters. Their victory in Miami changed the mood inside Formula One completely. Before Miami, Mercedes looked untouchable. After Miami, people started asking dangerous questions. Then the FIA restriction arrived almost immediately afterward. Now every team believes the championship could reopen. And once Formula One teams smell opportunity, development becomes ruthless. Ferrari pushes harder. McLaren gains confidence. Red Bull becomes more aggressive strategically. Pressure starts attacking Mercedes from every direction at once. That is why Toto Wolff sounds so frustrated publicly. Because from Mercedes' perspective, they did exactly what Formula One has always rewarded. They found a gray area before everyone else. They solved the engineering puzzle first. Then, once the advantage became too visible, the rules suddenly shifted against them. And here is the uncomfortable truth nobody inside Formula One wants to admit openly. Many engineers probably respect Mercedes for it. Because this sport has always celebrated innovation operating right on the edge of legality. That edge is where legendary teams are created. But Formula One also fears domination. Especially domination that starts making races predictable. So now the entire sport arrives in Canada with one massive unanswered question hanging over the paddock. Was Mercedes truly unbeatable? Or was the engine loophole hiding a much deeper weakness inside the W17 all along? And this is where the entire controversy turns into something far more dangerous for Mercedes. Because Canada is not just testing their engine. It is testing their identity as the dominant team in Formula One. For months, Mercedes controlled the grid psychologically. Rivals arrived at race weekends already expecting to lose. That kind of pressure changes everything inside a championship fight. But once cracks appear, fear disappears with them. And the FIA may have created the first real crack of the entire season. Because now every team is watching Mercedes differently. Not with frustration. With hope. Ferrari believes the gap can finally close. McLaren believes Miami was not luck anymore. And Red Bull, despite their difficult start, suddenly has a target again. That emotional shift matters more than most people realize. Formula One teams survive on momentum. Confidence changes development speed. Confidence changes driver performance. Confidence changes strategy calls under pressure. One week weekend can completely alter the atmosphere inside a garage. And Mercedes knows that better than anyone. That is why Toto Wolff reacted so aggressively once the FIA confirmed the new testing procedures. Because from his perspective, this was not simply a clarification. It was an intervention. A direct attack on the very advantage Mercedes spent months developing legally under the original system. And honestly, there is one detail that makes this entire situation even more uncomfortable. The FIA already plans to continue these hot condition engine checks permanently moving forward. That tells you something important. Formula One believes Mercedes exposed a weakness in the regulations themselves. The governing body would not change long-term procedures unless the loophole was genuinely significant. And that creates the biggest irony of all. Mercedes may have built one of the smartest engine concepts Formula One has seen in years. Only for the sport itself to decide it became too effective to continue. That tension sits at the center of this entire story. Innovation versus control. Engineering brilliance versus competitive balance. Because deep inside Formula One, there is always an invisible limit. Teams are encouraged to innovate, until the innovation becomes uncomfortable for everybody else. Mercedes may have crossed that invisible line. But the most important part comes now. Because Canada will finally reveal whether the engine advantage was carrying the entire project, or whether Mercedes still has enough performance left to dominate anyway. And if they do remain dominant after the FIA restriction, that becomes terrifying for the rest of the grid. Because then Ferrari, McLaren, and Red Bull must face an even worse reality. The loophole was not the real secret. The W17 itself may simply be the best car in Formula One. And remember, Mercedes is not arriving in Canada empty-handed. The team is bringing major aerodynamic upgrades to Montreal as well. Officially, Mercedes describes them cautiously. But inside the paddock, rival teams are already asking the obvious question. Are these upgrades designed to improve the car? Or to compensate for performance Mercedes knows they are about to lose? That uncertainty is creating paranoia everywhere. Because Formula One teams hate unknowns more than anything. And right now, nobody truly knows what Mercedes will look like once the FIA restrictions fully apply. Not Ferrari. Not McLaren. Not even the FIA itself. Which means the Canadian Grand Prix may become the most important technical test of the entire season. One weekend. One regulation shift. One moment that could completely change the championship fight. Because if Mercedes suddenly struggles, the entire grid attacks. But if they survive this pressure and still dominate, then Toto Wolff may leave Canada more dangerous than ever. Not weakened. Motivated. And Formula One has seen before what happens when Mercedes feels targeted by the sport itself. And maybe that is the scariest possibility of all for the rest of Formula One. Because history shows Mercedes becomes most dangerous when they feel cornered. Every dominant dynasty in this sport eventually reaches a moment where the paddock tries to slow them down. Rule changes. Technical directives. FIA clarifications. Political pressure. Mercedes has lived through all of it before. And Toto Wolff knows exactly how these wars work. That is why his reaction before Canada feels less like panic and more like defiance. Because inside Mercedes, they genuinely believe they did nothing wrong. The engine passed inspections. The FIA approved the system initially. The regulations were followed exactly as written. From their perspective, the real issue is not legality. It is that the rest of the grid could not catch them fast enough. And now Formula One itself is stepping in to close the gap artificially. That belief creates an incredibly dangerous mindset inside a team. Especially a team as experienced as Mercedes. Because once engineers feel targeted, motivation changes completely. Every upgrade becomes personal. Every race becomes political. Every victory becomes a message. And Canada may become the first chapter of that war. But there is another layer to this story people are only beginning to realize. If Mercedes truly loses between 10 and 20 horsepower under the new checks, as estimates suggest, then the first races of 2026 may have completely distorted the real competitive order of the season. Think about that carefully. Ferrari may have been closer than results showed. McLaren may have already had race-winning pace earlier than expected. Even Red Bull's struggles could look very different once Mercedes loses part of its straight-line advantage. That possibility changes how the entire championship is interpreted. Because suddenly, Canada is not simply another race weekend. It is almost a reset point. The first moment where Formula One may finally see the true balance of power between the top teams. And that creates enormous pressure on the drivers too. George Russell and Kimi Antonelli now arrive in Montreal carrying expectations nobody can fully measure yet. If Mercedes stays dominant, they silence the entire paddock instantly. But if performance drops even slightly, questions explode everywhere. Was the dominance real? Was the car overrated? Did the FIA save the championship? And Formula One media will not wait patiently for answers. Every sector time will become a headline. Every speed trap number will become a debate. Every radio message will be analyzed for signs of panic. That is the environment Mercedes enters this weekend. Not calm confidence. Pure scrutiny. And maybe the most fascinating part is this. The FIA may have accidentally created the perfect storm for Formula One fans. Because whether Mercedes wins or struggles, Canada now carries massive consequences either way. If Mercedes falls backward, the championship fight becomes alive again overnight. Ferrari gains belief. McLaren gains momentum. Red Bull sees opportunity. The season transforms instantly into chaos. But if Mercedes survives the restriction and still controls the field, then the rest of the grid faces something psychologically devastating. The realization that even after Formula One changed the rules around them, Mercedes still remained untouchable. And that outcome could break rival confidence even harder than before. Because then the entire paddock would understand one brutal truth. The loophole was never the full story. Mercedes may simply have built a better Formula One car than everyone else. That possibility is hanging over Montreal right now like a storm cloud. One race weekend could completely redefine the season. One FIA decision could reshape the future of Formula One regulations forever. And one question now sits at the center of everything. When the lights go out in Canada, will we witness the beginning of Mercedes' collapse? Or the moment Toto Wolff turns this controversy into fuel for an even more terrifying era of dominance?